Walking with Dinosaurs has returned. It is a revival of the 1999 series of the same name. The original was a very important piece of media for my own childhood, and I have seen all the subsequent installments of the series. For all that I loved of the original, much of the information and animation did not stand the test of time, so I'm sure as many of you were, I was excited to hear about this revival. Then I heard and saw some things over the past months that eroded this anticipation. I will be entirely honest, I was somewhat dreading this review. It's something I've gotten a lot of messages requesting my thoughts on, and I've made a lot of Paleo media reviews in the past, so figured it would probably be on the roster, but I was starting to think I might just skip it. I'm not a paleontologist nor a professional reviewer, so I don't exactly bring a lot of credentials to the table, but I am an author who likes paleontology and have now done several narratives in the style of Walking with Dinosaurs, for whatever that's worth. I really don't like being negative. The world can be a grim place, and I much prefer to try and make it a little brighter. I mean, sure, I've got that goblin in me. Sometimes a well-placed jab can be really funny and make you feel terribly clever. However, when you constantly spew negativity, it can have some pretty ugly consequences on yourself and those around you. You can say 100 nice things, but say one cruel remark, and it can be the only thing people remember you for. Especially if you have a large platform that can have other serious consequences too. As a creator that puts my passion and effort out into the world, it can feel very demoralizing when people hate on what you've put your heart and time into. I won't pretend to be perfect. I've contributed to negativity online and in real life, but I really try to avoid it. Something I find deeply disgusting about YouTube these days is that being an armchair hater is a highly lucrative business, and just vomiting negativity out into the world has made people millions. Certainly didn't want to contribute to that atmosphere, so you can imagine my joy when it wasn't nearly as bad as I'd been led to believe. There were certainly problems that I'll freely address shortly, but there's a lot to like about this series, and the creators should be very proud of this product of their time, love, and effort. The following is going to include some spoilers. I'm going to try to avoid too much comparison to the original, set aside nostalgia, and give it its due as its own thing, but for the reason I'm about to get to, that's easier said than done. One of the most common criticisms I've seen of this revival is that it does not follow the structure of the previous show. The first series was, at its core, a broad strokes overview to the rise and fall of the dinosaurs. It opens with the end of the Triassic as dinosaurs are just beginning their establishment, segues to the late Jurassic as dinosaurs have truly come into their own as iconic giants we know and love. Episodes 3 and 4 explore what's going on in the sea and skies respectively. 5 shows that dinosaurs are thriving in all corners of the world, and Episode 6 brings us the conclusion of the Age of Dinosaurs. Each episode follows a protagonist or two, but through a macro lens, it's a mostly chronological narrative of dinosaurs through their time. The 2025 revival does not follow this structure. The episodes themselves do to a certain extent. Again, we follow a protagonist animal, and as I'll get to later, this comes with a lot of strength as the protagonists, this time, are specific specimens that we know from the fossil record. However, the show lacks the broad strokes narratives that so many have praised the original for. That's fine by me, but I think many were expecting it to be another overview of the age of dinosaurs with an updated perspective on what we know now. Instead, we got a time-jumping narrative with 3 out of the 6 episodes focusing on the late Cretaceous of North America. I think the structure of this show was generally a strong point, and while I don't speculate as to why they had the same name but not the same structure, it doesn't really feel like a revival. It feels like its own thing for the most part. Not when there were so many other series in the Walking With franchise that had their own distinct vibe. Me personally, I would have gone with the name being a unique show in the Walking With franchise instead of trying to brand it as a revival. Walking with Dinosaurs, Memoirs of Deep Time was what I titled this review, and is more along the lines of what I think they maybe could have gone with. The original was a narrative on the rise and fall of dinosaurs. This series was more focused on individual specimens and their stories, what we know about dinosaurs and how we know it. It's not the same, so marketing it as such isn't the direction I would have gone. Considering how much I've seen this critique, I think it's fair to say I'm not alone in this opinion. Make it part of the franchise, not a revival. The accuracy of many models in the original show were criticized at the time and only have become more glaring the more we learn over time. This revival certainly improves upon that. Sometimes it breaks the believability of certain visuals, but if you're going to compromise verisimilitude for the sake of reality, this is the context to do it. The T-Rex of Jurassic Park is more believable in its movement and heavy footfalls, but this depiction is more accurate. T-Rex in Jurassic Park moves and sounds like what we'd expect. As Henry Sharp, one of the consultants, explained on Twitter, we don't have a proxy for something like T-Rex, so it's hard for us to conceptualize how it may have moved. It probably would look a bit weird and weightless considering it was a lightly built and bipedal predator. There were several points in the show where things didn't look quite right to me, but I checked my assumptions. Not every animation gets a free pass, but it is important to keep in mind that in trying to be realistic, it might not always look the most believable. Verisimilitude is the main goal of a film for entertainment, so if you want your audience to believe these animals, which Jurassic Park does extremely well. I don't think it's the fault of the revival that they lack this believability, and I'm glad they prioritize being as accurate to available data as possible. For all the critiques that the title doesn't fit and seems a marketing ploy to ride nostalgia, I am happy to say that the show itself doesn't have a lot of nostalgia bait and trappings that I was initially a bit concerned about. They prioritized making designs accurate to available data and weren't beholden to color patterns or visual callbacks to what they had before. I'm sure that some fans would have enjoyed it, but I'm personally glad they didn't. Walking with Dinosaurs 2025 stands on its own and is better for it. A strong point is when they use pathologies in showcased specimens and the narrative. The Albertosaurus suffering a face bite in the same place that the fossil showed, and the old bull Pachyrhinosaurus suffering an impact and shrugging it off came to mind. This is what I hoped to see, and I was glad that it delivered. This helps to ground the story in the bones, which is ultimately what this version of Walking with Dinosaurs is about. A criticism of the first Walking with Dinosaurs is that there's no context to explain what is known, what is reasonable assumption, and what is a necessary speculation to tell a compelling and grounded narrative. At this, Walking with Dinosaurs 2025 is much stronger. The paleontologist explaining most narrative beats puts a highlight on what we know and how we know it, so again it's easier to make these distinctions. This gets to something that several friends who aren't big into paleo mentioned to me when we were watching Prehistoric Planet, that they really liked the explanations at the end of each of the episodes, and many of them wanted more. I think having this be a greater emphasis in the Walking with Dinosaurs revival was a good choice from that perspective. That said, I found myself generally frustrated by the field segments. They would have been greatly elevated by an interviewer. As it was, the experts were talking to each other in a way that they would speak to a layperson and, coupled with using to me sure looked like lab-prepped specimens that they pretended to pull out of the rock, was a bit ridiculous. At the end of the episode, they often filmed and spoke in a lab. These unearthed segments I felt were much stronger than what was throughout the narrative itself. I think in the field, having lab-prepped examples and explaining to a narrator would have been a lot stronger. Having the fossil segments interrupt narrative flow got a bit frustrating at times. The first episode in particular got quite grating at this. When it cuts away every time something interesting is about to happen, viewers can be forgiven for having the same reaction to these segments as they do to constant commercial breaks, like the one I'm about to put here. But I don't think every interruption was bad. Again, the Pachyrhinosaurus and Albertosaurus episodes I think did this overall well, and it was nice to have them added context directly from pathologies on specimens. I don't know if these episodes actually had fewer interruptions than the first episode, but I didn't notice them as much. Lucititan also got great work with this in the trackways. Perhaps on a second watch, the fossil segments of the first episode might not bother me as much. After all, it has the unfortunate placement as the first episode that had to break the expectation of what this series was going to be, following the structure of what is supposed to be a revival of. It's not an easy thing to overcome. Even so, it seemed that they were less relevant to the story than they were in some of the later episodes. This format was definitely strongest when it used pathology to ground the narrative. I have a few other qualms, though most are a consequence of the show not having the budget of its predecessor, and I don't want to hold that strongly against it. It seemed there weren't enough size variation among the individuals, even when the narrative said otherwise. There also weren't nearly enough juveniles as far as I could tell, but again, this is probably just a consequence of budget issues, or them wanting to more closely abide what we know from the fossils. We might presume there were a lot more young individuals of these animals, as they tend to be slow-growing and have a lot of offspring, so you'd expect more size variation in the herds, but again, perhaps it was a consequence of budget limitations. I know Henry Sharp also specifically mentioned that age segregation was probably a thing for Edmontosaurus, so this is more a macro critique than anything specific. They not only weren't given a whole lot of budget to work with, they also wanted to make it widely available. It's free on PBS here in the States. They aren't going to have Apple dollars to throw around like Prehistoric Planet, so just know that going into the show. Some of the animation and models are very strong. The Carcharodontosaurus in particular caught my eye. When they play with dappled lighting, like the Triceratops and T-Rex fight, things look a lot better. In the wide herd shots, they wouldn't have been better served kicking up a lot more dust, but again, I respect that they don't have as much time and money to work with as they did in the original. Something that I will confess did annoy me was that there was a lot of times that a clumsy baby was in peril and glower and menacing predators were unable to land a bite. It seemed a lot of the same kind of goofy back and forth dodging and antics were employed. Not saying every predator and every attempt to grab a baby dinosaur is going to land a kill, just that I felt like it became an overused gimmick. You telling me that an Asdarchid can't aim that beak with any precision? Come on now. The show also had a lot less gruesome than the original. Perhaps they felt a pressure to censor for kids, but man, not to wallow in nostalgia, but the original had some brutal sequences. Always hiding a kill behind a log? We can handle a pliosaur ripping an ichthyosaur in half. You can show us how horrific a T-Rex landing a kill would actually be. Go there. Kids are going to love it. I don't blame the creators. This just stinks of executive interference. They're the cowards. Overall, though, I do want to reiterate that I think by and large the animation is quite incredible, in both motion and details. I think some of the weakest shots were a lot of the ones we saw in early promos, which is a baffling decision. With a few minor exceptions, I will give a lot of praise to the animation. And as a dweeb for accuracy, it was really exciting to see so many of the concepts that I've read about realized in such attention to detail and care. A lot of the design choices that I also didn't like in promo stuff looked a lot better in motion and in the full context, like the overbite lips of the tyrannosaurs and theropods in general, for example. Is not a choice that I liked early on, but it's definitely won me over. Not in a way that I'm going to start implementing myself, but at least one that has, I think, a lot more aesthetic merit than I originally gave it credit for. Just in general, I've done a complete 180 on my opinion of the Albertosaurus, for example. Well, maybe not complete 180. I still have a little bit of personal subjective qualms about the spread of the coloration on the face. But again, that's not a problem with the design. It is just my own taste. I think it's a bit... I would rather the coloration be a bit more concentrated, I guess. I prefer this spread that we saw in Hank's concept art of the same design. But even with all that said, there's quite a few shots that it just lands very well. So again, even that's grown on me quite a bit. A question I had was regarding the animation of the tails. A study published in 2021 suggests that when some dinosaurs moved, the flexation of the muscles that connect femur to tail would pull the tail toward the flexing muscle, i.e. the leg is pulled back and the tail toward it. This makes intuitive sense when you think about it. A muscle flexes, so pulls the tail in that direction. It's just how muscles work. However, the opposite is seen in, for example, Jurassic Park. The tails sway with the motion of the animal in a much more passive way, presumably because that's what a person wearing a dinosaur tail or a chicken with a fake tail stuck on it is going to show. We don't have these muscles, so the tail just sways with gravity. In Walking with Dinosaurs 2025, the tail seemed to sway with the weight of the animal in at least the shots that I took notice of. Sure, maybe this is a fussy observation made by someone who has spent a lot of time looking into the anatomy and motion of these animals, and indeed is key to my own version of an aquatic Spinosaurus in my fantasy project, and it's possible that animators simply didn't account for or even know about this study. It doesn't strike me as going against the accuracy they otherwise seem to have prioritized. Then again, I'm just some dweeb. I'm not an expert, and considering Hank Sharp was pretty close consultant in the locomotion and anatomy, and I'm sure he knows this, I wouldn't rule out that I may be overlooking factors. The study I cited focused on Coelophysis, a fairly small and lightly built animal. Their tails weighed about as much as tissue paper, so the strength of the muscle could have had a much greater factor. It's possible that for something as big as T-Rex, the weight of their tail was enough to counter the flexation of their muscles during a casual step and may have only gone to the muscle flexing factor in a faster jog. I'm not going to sit here and say the depiction is wrong, it's just something that jumped out at me as going against my own personal understanding. The understanding of an amateur, to be clear. I defer to people who actually study these things, but for my own work, I'd love to know if there was an omission or if it was based on a formal study or educated guesswork. I know this show incorporated a lot of unpublished or newly published research, so I certainly can't rule out the possibility that they are working with information I just haven't come across. Then again, despite all that, I was just looking over the Gorgosaurus segment, and it looks like their tails do move in the way of the study, so maybe that's just a fluke of the T-Rex? I'm not sure. Maybe I should watch the whole thing again and keep an eye out for it, but I just don't have that kind of time. So I guess just put a pin in maybe I'm full of So these are my thoughts on Walking with Dinosaurs 2025. It's got a lot going for it. Some rough edges, but I think it's still worth a watch both for dedicated and casual fans of dinosaurs and paleontology. It lacks the cohesive narrative in both the series and each episode that made the first so strong. Yes, many field segments had merit in adding context, but for the vast majority I felt they broke up the narrative in almost every instance I think would have been better placed at the end of the episode. For all the spectacular visuals of Prehistoric Planet, I said in my review of that show that I still prefer the narrative of Walking With, and the revival does not fully recapture that. It's a bit unfortunate that it had the baggage of being tied to a very beloved series, but that's a choice someone made by marketing it as a revival instead of its own thing, which, while watching, it was. Some folks don't like spoilers, but I think you'll enjoy it more if you go in knowing what you're getting into. It's a solid show, and people who worked on it have much to be proud of. It's only on PBS for a few months. I encourage you to go give it a watch and support it if you got the time, so we can get more like this. Alright, well, all that ran longer than expected. I guess I had a lot to say. Shocking. Anyway, now back to work, and I hope you all have a great weekend. Cheers, folks!